This would be more like being Snout GC, to be honest, because, you know, I can't talk about being your GC.
All right, so our next speaker is DeeAnn.
Hey! One of the things that I did not do in preparing my little presentation on being GC is look at the Evite to find out who'd actually be here. So I thought, you know, I'll talk about some of the things that Team Snout does when we're planning a game and when we're being GC, so that people who want to, you know, maybe just kind of dip their toe in can see what we do. You guys have all dipped your toes in lots and lots of times, except for Alan. And so I guess I'm preaching to the choir. Yeah, so here we are. So what I want to talk about is basically logistics, because that's what I do. So the planning, the insurance, the taxes, and some problems that you might encounter in a game. Let's see if this button works for me. All right, so from our perspective, planning a game is actually surprisingly similar to running one. There's just an awful lot more of it. But, I mean, you still have to form your team. You still have to figure out what on earth kind of game are we going to make. You need to make it, whatever it is. Whereas if you're a player, you do your application. You have to keep kind of going for a while, and at some point you're like, man, this is hard. Do I really want to do it? That would be what we call the go, no-go decision, in which one decides not to give up, and then you keep working until eventually at the end of all the various steps, you have your game weekend and you resolve your finances, and it's done, finally, over. I'm not going to talk about all that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens up to right there to keeping working. And then I'll jump into my pitfalls, or things that we've learned. You know, don't make the mistakes Team Snout has made. Do as I tell you, not as I did. All right, so like forming a team, again, it's like playing. There's just a lot more of it. You find people that you think you can work together with and that you like. Because in the end, for most of us in this room, making a game is a hobby. It's not our job. It's something that we're doing for the fun of it. So find people. Now, we poach. I mean, Sean, he's not on Team Snout, except for when he wants to be. I mean, as soon as we find somebody who says, you know, I'd really love to help with a game, I'd be like, you're so in. Please come help us. And for new people, I'd say do that. If somebody just presses interest, find them, grab them, and suck them in. All right, this is great. So you form your GC team, you got it together, you know kind of that we're going to do it, and now we want to figure out what it is that we're going to do. Define the target. For me, from a planning perspective, this is the most important step on planning. What on earth are we trying to do? If you don't know what it is, how do you know that you made the game that you wanted? Beyond that, you need to sit down and say, okay, so now that I know what it is that I want, what are the things that we have to have? Because if everybody on this GC that's working on our hobby together doesn't get something that they want, why should they stay with us? So we set our priorities. And then if we sit down and we've made our big list of priorities and we said, this is what we have to have, can we do it? Next slide, please. All right, so for our first meeting, we look at doing two things. What is our framework, and what do we have to have? And really, that's kind of the first thing that we do with our games. What kind of game is it? Is it going to be like Midnight Madness? We start at night, we move on, we come back, and it all lasts a short period of time? Or, I'm going to pop over here and get some water. Or do we want to have something like Hogwarts, where we immerse you in the game? And how many people can we handle if we do that? Yes?
So this is your sample first meeting agenda. Do you resolve these things after a meeting?
No, sometimes it takes us 2 or 3. Sometimes. You laugh at me. Well, you know, part of this is we might be kicking around ideas by email for a month or 2 months or 3 months. But when we decide we're going to get together and we're going to make a game, we kind of have some general idea what it is that we're trying to do. Now we want to like make sure that that's actually what we're going to do.
So these things will all get resolved by the time you make the go, no-go decision.
Oh, they'll be more than resolved by then. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the first things we do is we look at, are we trying to do what we want to do, or are we all pulling in the same direction? So yeah. And then after we have resolved those things, however long they take, we then sit down and we make our schedule and we get to work. And this is what we do next. So how often are we going to meet? I mean, for us, once we've decided we're going to do the game, we meet every week because it works for us, because you can continue to have momentum. You have some action that you have to perform every week. You can move on forward from there. So we set up our schedule. As we get closer to the game, we go to twice a week. And then we go to twice a week plus every weekend. And then in the days leading up to the actual game, we're like, if you can be here, please. But then that's not really any different than any other hobby that takes up a lot of your time. I know bowlers who do stuff like that when they're coming up to the end of a league game. I know people who play bridge. I mean, we're not that weird. We feel like we are, but we're really not that weird. Okay, so once we've done that, we make up our list of what all needs to be done. I mean, we've played in games, so we have a general idea. We need a route. We need to have puzzles. We need to have a start. We need to have an end, and then assign people to them. Our breakdown goes like this. There's a nagger, or the project manager if you're in business. I used to call that the mommy role because it was almost always me, except for Midnight Madness, it was Curtis, so I didn't think it would be polite to put mommy here. Somebody who's responsible for the game start. Because, a lot of times you want to start off with some kind of a breakdown activity, or just something to say, okay, we have started. So we assign somebody to that. And so on, until we have all of our activities assigned to somebody. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to have a person for every activity, but we know who's responsible for it in the end. And then, of course, your nagger, or your head mommy, is responsible for kind of following up with everybody else. And then we do it, and follow up in our meetings. Okay, so can you move me forward? I know it sounds like it's ridiculous, but really doing a game is as simple as making a list of everything you're going to do and then doing it. We don't do that. As Teresa pointed out, I don't like to have to choose between the teams. So my approach is I come up with a way that I believe is fair. I tell you what it is, and then you've been armed with all the information, go to town. Just because it would have killed me to have to choose between 35 different teams or 60 different teams. I mean, after our 16 slots in Hogwarts filled up in 16 hours, I was crying trying to figure out how we could fit in 4 or 8 more until Curtis said, snap out of it. And that was that. Okay, so what we don't do is we never announce without our go, no go decision. I mean, we sit down and we always build into any game a period where we say, are we doing what we wanted to do? Can we get it finished? And can we all be happy with it? And then as a team, we say, okay, go or no go.
Have there been examples of no-go where you've not announced?
We have announced on every one, but on Midnight Madness, I voted no go.
Are there games that almost happened that ended up
not for us, no. We've been almost always positive. We did have on Hogwarts a little bit of discussion on whether we were going to go or no go, because we were close. I think we were 5 people were go and 3 people were no go. And so we had to have around the table talk about why do you feel like we shouldn't go on this? And it was generally something like, this role is just too big for me. And people were like, I don't think we can get this done. And so we reallocated the responsibilities. But yeah, it just seems like if you feel like you got to haul in the brakes, or even sometimes some people have to step out, like Jeff did. He had to. So we've had people, not want to go or not be able to go and have to step out. But yeah, I mean, if people aren't showing up anymore, if you're not having fun, then maybe you want to call it a no-go. All right, next. All right, so it's a go. This is the part where I talk about all the things where we ran into problems. And maybe you want to learn from our experience and not do it. So here we go. Money will be first. Can you move on? Insurance will be first. I had to have my pitfalls. So whether to buy insurance or not to buy insurance is always going to be an individual decision. But it kind of comes down to this. If something goes wrong, and things do go wrong, does anybody have anything that they couldn't afford to lose? And if you do have something that you couldn't afford to lose, I strongly advise you to get insurance. Even if it costs a lot, because you never know when you're going to have the game where maybe somebody falls down a mine shaft. You don't know that's going to happen. You don't know you're the person who's going to have that happen. I mean, in my first game in Amnesia, one of our players scrambled out onto slippery rocks at Sutro Bass, and I'm watching down there as the surf is crashing, and I'm thinking, if he slides, it's over. We are never going to be able to rescue him. He will die. Things like that can happen anytime, anywhere. And even things you wouldn't expect. Like, I never, in a million years, during the Justice Unlimited game, ever even worried about somebody falling down in the park while they were playing tag, which would be the magic lasso activity, and breaking their leg. It never even occurred to me to worry about that. I mean, I worried about people climbing trees. I worried about people climbing playground equipment. I worried about all those things, but I didn't worry about running around in the grass. But it happened. You just don't know. So what we always go for is some kind of special event insurance. We go for the sports one because I think of playing the game as a sport. And in this case, it requires a waiver. You have to have some person or entity that is responsible for your event. In our case, it's Team Snout. And then you get your insurance and you move on. In Midnight Madness, it was, what, maybe 25% of our budget, but it was worth it.
One of the comments on
Yeah.
insurance, which is if you end up renting, say, a state park or some other location, they often require a certain amount of liability insurance. So if you already have it, then you're all set. They usually require $1 million general
Or $2 million
liability.
sometimes, yeah.
So sometimes two, yeah. So those are something. Sometimes you have to get it.
Yeah, sometimes you do. So if you have sites you want to rent. Yes?
If you wouldn't mind, you say it was 25% of your budget. I don't recall what that scales to. Can you say any real numbers? And how does that scale to how many participants you have, or how long the event goes?
In our case, we specify the thing, and the type of insurance would be good for. One of them, I was looking at the policies, said that the period could be up to 7 days. In our case, it was 2, Saturday and Sunday. They don't really limit the number of participants in our case until it was like over thousands of people. So, with 1,200 people, it doesn't really matter. But it was about $540. Okay, for Hogwarts, it was a little bit less, about $500, and we had more people going more places, and a few more additional insureds because we did have sites that needed to be covered just in case something happened to somebody there. So Midnight Madness was an inexpensive game, so that was a significant fraction of the budget. On Hogwarts, which was a more expensive game, we were doing more. It was just a tiny fraction of the budget. I think we're going to have to give you the mic.
You said that Team Snout is the one who is insured here. Is Team Snout a legal entity?
Yeah, we created Team Snout as a legal entity. Okay, that does take a lot of work, and I'll talk about that in a minute now. But when we'll get that into money, yes, we created Team Snout as an entity. So if you have special event insurance, a lot of times you can have somebody who's responsible for the entity who would be the one who's covered. So the person who is ultimately responsible, much as people are ultimately responsible for their weddings. You can do that in special event. But we didn't go that way because Team Snout is an unincorporated association recognized in California. Okay? And then again, personal umbrella insurance is kind of one way to go for yourself if you have a person that might be responsible for the game. So the person who's most likely to get sued. Okay, and let's move on to money. When to spend it? For us, we spend our money whether we got it from you or not. If we need it, we spend it. So in general, what that means to us is that our team members are floating the game alone until the game is over. The only things we try to hold off on are the expensive purchases, the ones where one person couldn't really absorb that. Because a lot of times you select your teams and get your payment a couple of months before the game, but you've been building for 3, 4, or 5 months before that. It's just kind of a little tip, something to look at. A pitfall is if your cash flow is really low, you might find yourself running into problems if you don't plan for it. Okay? More on money. Who gets the checks? One of the things that we learned pretty early on, which would be our first game, is, yeah, I'm sorry, you guys, is that a bank will not take a check that's not addressed to an actual real living person. So we thought it'd be really cool if they could take checks for homicide, but I called up and they said, what? No, that's money laundering. And that was the end of that. So if you haven't formed up an entity, which takes a considerable amount of time and work, and in some cases a lot of money, give it to a person, a GC member takes it. So you can mail it to Team Snout, care of DeeAnn Soul, and write your checks to DeeAnn Soul, and DeeAnn Soul is thus ultimately responsible for the money. If you form an entity, then the checks are made out to Team Snout. Team Snout is responsible for that income, okay? But that setup will take time and money away from the time that you could be spending developing your game. And on your first game, maybe you don't want to do that. Yes?
I'll posit a third one for those of you out there. Just set up a PayPal account with your team name and then funnel through that way and it goes to your bank. And so then the teams feel like they're paying a team, but the individual gets it and then you can distribute.
Yeah, but in the end, they're still paying to that person. So if somebody was to send a check, they'd still have to send it to DeeAnn Soul or whomever.
Is there any way to do this if game control is trying to remain anonymous? What would be the best way to collect the funds?
You know, I've never tried to remain anonymous, and I cannot answer that question.
Unmarked cash envelopes.
You can do a DBA. In San Francisco, it costs $25 to register a DBA. Then you're supposed to file a notice in the paper, and you can take that DBA to a bank and open an account. It'll probably still be under one of your social security numbers, but you would then be able to accept checks to, say, Ghost Patrol or Team Snout.
Which you can do if you file it. It's basically doing business as, is what DBA stands for.
It's his business name.
Figure out who it is, it's gamers. So.
Gamers can figure it out, yeah. But again, a DBA would be an example of something that's going to take time to go down to there and $25 or whatever to fill out the paperwork, to print it in the paper, and then you have to dissolve your DBA when you're done with it. So there's a little bit more paperwork involved. So we usually just went for this one. Either people send checks to me, or we created Team Snout as an entity, and they send it to Team Snout.
The way we dodged it for Midnight Madness, in which we did try to remain secret until as late as possible, was we revealed ourselves during the welcome, you've been accepted to the game meeting, bring your checkbook.
Oh, so yeah, but we didn't actually take payment secretly.
No.
But okay, so managing money. That's kind of one of the things just to watch out for. That's a pitfall, and it can kind of hurt you and cause you some pain. And I feel for you guys in Ghost Patrol, I really do. All right, next. Money, is it income? Now this one was the biggest and most horrific surprise to me personally on our first game. And that is that the IRS considers any money that you get for anything you do where it can be considered a service to be income. Even when you think, but I'm just, doing this for all my friends in the game community. It's not actual real money. It's real money. They want you to report it. Now, whether they're going to chase you down for $5,000 or $6,000 is a variable question. But let's posit a scenario here. Let's say that you happen to, 30 or 40 years from now, be in a position to be appointed to office by the President of the United States, and then, of course, everybody's going through your entire history with a fine-tooth comb, and they find out that you happen to be the person who was taking the checks for $5,000 back when you were young and in grad school or just out of school, and you never reported taxes on it. And by now, it's snowballed up to the point where your $5,000 is turned into $128,000 in taxes and fines and interest and fees. It might get you later, as it did some people that we might be aware of who were appointed to office recently.
They ran games.
I don't know, but you know what I mean.
If you can imagine.
It is income. It's up to you to decide what to do with it. And I'm just going to tell you some pitfalls on things to know.
If you spend all that money on the game, then you've got no net profit. Why would it be taxable?
Still income.
It's still income, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So any income that you get, regardless, even if it's a hobby, things we do for fun, like the game, is taxable. So for example, if you run a game with net proceeds of, say, $20-something thousand, as Hogwarts was, and you haven't decided that, hey, I don't want to have to pay taxes on $20-something thousand and have formed up your Team Snout as an independent entity, then somebody, that would be DeeAnn, will have to count $20,000 on her income. And in that case, I'd be like, okay, $20,000 extra on my income, but I'm going to deduct my hobby expenses, which I can do. The IRS does allow me to do this as a miscellaneous deduction. But they're going to say only the part that is over 2% of my adjusted gross income. So if I made $50,000 that year, including that $20,000, so I was very poor, then I could deduct the part that was over $1,000, which means that I would eat $1,000 in taxes.
Why not just file a Schedule C?
That is itemizing my taxes.
No,
Schedule C is profit and loss from a business.
Right, you'd have to form up as a business for that. Then you can do it as
You
profit
can be a
and loss.
sole proprietor. You don't have to incorporate
You
anything.
can, again, if you decide to form up the entity, but it is something to be aware of. However, they might look back at you later to say, was this a hobby or was this a business? And one of the tests on a business is, are you doing this to make money? Okay, and that one can bite you. I mean, they look at things as, do you do it continuously? Are you doing it in an effort to show a profit? Have you shown a profit out of the last 3 to 5 years? Things like that. So you can always say it's a business, but you have to kind of be able to back it up. Yeah, all right. So Curtis would like me to tell you the professional golfer story. Or I can tell the story about the writer who was doing research with prostitutes. I think that one's a more interesting story. There was a writer who was writing a novel where prostitutes were some of the main characters in his novel. And so he went and he talked. Now, he didn't necessarily do anything else as far as we know, but he talked to a whole lot of prostitutes. And he paid these prostitutes for his time, for their time, to the tune of many, many, many thousands of dollars. And he tried to deduct that on his taxes, and the IRS audited him subsequently and said, we don't believe you. So he took that to appeals. So he appealed it and said, I can show you all my receipts, the people I talked to, some interviews, all of my documentation. And yes, I can prove that this novel was turned in and that it was subsequently self-published, and it exists out there, and I hope that many, many people will buy it. And what they said to that was, well, okay, we believe that you were trying to make money on your novel, but you did things that we don't believe is normal for people in the business of writing. And so they disallowed it. Okay? They considered that to be a business, but they still disallowed his deductions. Now, in the story about the golfer, he said his job was to be a professional golfer. And he did not make any money for like 8 years. But he had a lot of deductions as he went along and went to various tournaments and paid to get in and bought his equipment and all these things. And in his case, they said it was a hobby because he never actually made any money, even though he treated it in every way like a business. He just didn't do it enough for it to be a business. So, I mean, I don't really want to get into the whole business thing because it's long and involved, but it's just something to be aware of. And then you make your choices on your own. Okay, now Team Snout, it files its own taxes because it exists as a separate entity. And I think your JPT files its own taxes because it's a separate entity. Now, we created Team Snout as a nonprofit, which required a lot of paperwork to do it. And then, of course, the tax forms are kind of a nightmare to do. But then it's separate from any of us, and then it exists to make games. If you think you're going to make a lot of games, then maybe you might want to do that. But again, it's a lot of effort, and sometimes it might be better just to say, you know what, we'll just pay a little money on a hobby. Okay, next, money. Keep your records. Nothing really new here, but you do want to know who bought what it was for, and so you can pay it back at the end. And then after you close up all your accounts at the end, you can take your spreadsheet, you can put it away, and you can file it. if you buy any things with special tax rules, you do want to watch out for those. If you buy a computer for the team, well, you're going to have to depreciate that. So just, talk to somebody about taxes. If, for some reason, you should have the kind of game that can actually take your team out to do something, which we never do, because we figure that if you're going to give us money, we're going to let you see it at the end of the game. Watch out for entertainment. So basically just a couple of pitfalls. Okay, next. And then this is probably the biggest one, is once you get overwhelmed, and it will happen to everybody, scale back. Biggest things are look back at that list you made at the beginning of what was a must, what was a want, and what was a nice to have, and then cut them out. Because, you're going to find that you've had huge scope creep, and all of a sudden something you thought might be nice is suddenly on top of everybody's mind. And the teams won't know if you cut them out. I mean, if somebody said, you know what, I bet I could get this really rich and expensive movie star to come and talk, or I could find the guy who actually started the first game and get him to talk, you guys won't know whether we succeeded or failed unless we succeed. And then as for help, we do that all the time. It's super, super useful. The game community is very, very helpful. Your family is very helpful. They'll think you're crazy a lot of times, but they'll help. There are people out here who find games to be hugely fascinating, and they'd like to help with it if you can find them. I mean, I've had coworkers come and help. I've had random people who said, hey, I hear that you guys are doing this thing and that you might want some people to come talk on the phone. Can I do that? Sell the fun. Because if they think it'll be fun, people come out of the woodwork. That's why we do our playtests as parties, because a party's fun. That's why we do build nights. We treat them like quick quilting bees, because it's fun. I mean, anything that's fun, you can get people to do, even if what they're doing is really boring. No, if you're spending your whole time weaving these colored beads together or sitting down checking to make sure that there's no red bead in a place where it doesn't need to be, that in and of itself is not necessarily fun. But when you're with a whole bunch of other people and you can tell jokes and talk and eat and listen to music and sometimes go off and play different video games, that's fun. Remember the fun. Biggest thing is that there are so many fun activities involved in making a game. Don't forget about them. All right, and then of course, right here, more screwing up. Quality control. This one has bitten us more times than I ever want to talk about. And what we say now is if there is anything that a second person who did not help with it can look at it, have them look at it. Because every single time we didn't do a QC check, it got us. And then this one, it's not so super obvious, but we call it Only GC Thinks That's Funny. It always starts with, almost always starts with somebody going, hey, wouldn't it be funny if we made the teams do? And everybody laughs. And as soon as you hear everybody around the table laugh, you need to have your little warning red light going off in your head to say, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Because then you're going to step back and say, would I want to run naked through a fountain if I was a player? Would it be fun? And could I maybe be arrested? Because the second thing we always say for Team Snout is nobody dies, nobody goes to jail, and nobody bleeds. And sometimes we don't always make that, but those are our rules. I did have a broken leg in one of the games, and Jeff did injure himself. But other than that, nobody has ever died. Nobody has gone to jail. And these are very, very important things to remember. And that would be the end of my presentation. Does anybody have questions for me?
Do you rule out jails as potential blue sites?
Do you have any actual specific examples from that last bit of things where game control was laughing and haha, we should make them do that?
Yeah, we had a phone book that we did in one of the puzzles where we gave the teams a CD and a phone book. And in the phone book, we had red, and in the CD, we had herring. And we had people looking at red things for who knows how long. It was in our first game, and it was we thought it was hilarious at the time to tell you something was a red herring. But what we actually ended up doing was sending them looking through every freaking red thing they could possibly find in that phone book. It took hours. Other things that we did was we changed the answer to a puzzle, and then we had one person change the answer, QC their own work, and then during the game we found the problem and we had to call every single team as they got to that puzzle and tell them there was a typo in it, fix it for them on the spot so that they could go forward. Some other things is in another game, we had a math error in one of our formulas, and that threw our timing off for hours and hours. And as some people might realize, we had a clue where we put you in a coffin. And we thought that was the showpiece of our game. So we wanted every single team to see that coffin. So on the fly, we had to create a loop in our route to send our fast teams down past some puzzles and then back up again. Which maybe I wouldn't do again, but you know, you learn things as you go along. And that's one of the things that we've learned. Yes?
How many core people generally are on Team Snout for GC?
Well, every game has kind of a slightly different GC. Curtis and I are usually on them. Sean is almost always on them unless it's a game that he really wants to play in, like Justice Unlimited. But I don't want to come to the table unless I have 7 people that I think I can rely on. But that's my personal approach because there are a lot of different activities and I don't want to be responsible for everything. I've heard of teams that have done it successfully with 2. I sure wouldn't want to be them, but I've heard of them. And it kind of comes down to pretty much what any project manager is going to say. How long it's going to take to do something is going to be your resources plus your money plus your time. And so the more people I have, that gives me a few more resources.
A different question is, this is a lot of really great information about professional, sort of professional help advice, like the taxes and the money. And how did you come to talk to accountants or lawyers or anything?
I did research.
Okay.
And, you know, we did, like, for example, one of the things we learned is that if you form a nonprofit, you're exempt from the California franchise tax, which is $800 minimum that you would have to pay. But even the California franchise people don't necessarily know that. I was just reading through the paperwork, and so when we filled out our tax forms, we got last year a huge note with huge fines and all that for not paying the $800 minimum. And so I called, and they routed me to the guy who's responsible for nonprofits, and he said, "What are you?" And I said, "I'm an unincorporated association, and it says on page blah of this document, this," and I read it off to him, and he said, "Oh yeah, they just filled your paperwork out wrong," and he fixed it, and it was over. But a lot of stuff is just reading until you know what it says. I mean, we're really smart people here. We solve puzzles a lot of the time. Taxes are not that hard.
Is there an aha moment? Tell me the franchise.
Can we send the graph to the graph of a good puzzle to the IRS to simplify our taxes?
No, it wouldn't work. It doesn't follow their rules.
The game control thinks that's funny.
I'm sorry. I'm running so long on this. I'm already like 25 minutes.
Oh, yeah, so I was just going to say one other thing. For newer game controls or people who are interested in learning, you know, well, how do we find insurance? How do we get this legal stuff set up? You can always ask other GCs who've done it before you, and every single one of us, I mean, we're such an open community. You can just send an email to anyone, and we will tell you in excruciating detail, like which companies we contacted and what they do. And yeah, just always use your resources and ask other people who've run events, and we'll tell you all our sob stories.
This one right here. Remember this.
Yeah, only ask us. Don't ask Martin.
Always remember, the community will help. Ask for help if you don't know something. If you have a question about something we've done, I'll be happy to tell you. Send me an email.
I was going to say, as the most newbie person here, I thought it might be nice if people in the community, when you're running a game, it might be fun for you guys to encourage apprentices, people who haven't done it for either individuals or other teams, which might help with the poaching problem and also encouraging more teams to run, which is the problem
If
of.
we know somebody wants to help, we try to bring them in. We really do. I mean, we ask
So you guys might
for
want to,
help.
if anyone's interested, you might want to post that on the message board saying, looking to apprentices.
We'll gladly take volunteers.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for bearing with me.